spring practice starts, but no media availability today. No access. In fact, it will start on Thursday with practice cranking up at just before 8 a.m. And Brian Kelly will meet with the media after that at 9:45 on Thursday morning, and our guy Wilson Alexander will be there for all of it. During this spring camp, we will hear from new offensive coordinator Joe Sloan and defensive coordinator Blake Baker after a couple of practices. So I want to dive into Wilson and see what he thinks about what some of the stories are heading into today's action. Wilson, good morning. How are you, buddy?
Good morning, Jordy. How you guys doing?
Doing good. Good to see you as always. Spring today, as they get on the field. I know from the media standpoint, no access and no coaches speaking. But as we enter this portion of the schedule, what are some of the storylines you're looking forward to?
Well, looking forward to, once we can get out to practice, seeing maybe some of, how these wide receiver rotation is shaking out, who's maybe emerging there. If there's any young guys kind of making a move after LSU loses, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas going to have to replace quite a bit of production from that receiver group. Looking forward to seeing, if anybody emerges at corner and what that rotation looks like throughout the spring. Because I can't imagine that here in the spring, LSU is going to definitively know who its starting corners are. That's probably going to go all the way through preseason camp. But it's still going to be fascinating to kind of see, who's getting the reps there with the ones here whenever we have an open practice here in the spring. And then let's see, a couple other things, just what kind of stamp the new coaches put on the team. What sort of things they're changing, if any, what we're able to glean from what they might do schematically, I think will be interesting. And then also just, not that we're going to maybe learn a whole lot about Garrett Nussmeier that we didn't already know here in the spring, but just watching him go through his first spring as the starter will be interesting. And then a couple other maybe subtle ones that come to mind are on special teams, sort of often overlooked part of the game. But Xavier Thomas coming in as the punt returner, what kind of effect can he have? Because he was so good at it at Mississippi State. And also, is Peyton Todd ready to be the punter? I know that's kind of something maybe people don't think about, but he's been a backup for his entire career. Now Jay Bramblett's left. Peyton Todd's really the only scholarship punter on the roster anyway. Is he ready to take the job, or is LSU going to maybe need to look in the portal in the spring? That's probably something that they'll figure out too. But just, he's certainly in line to be that, but now he's got to go and prove that he can. Yeah,
without question. A former number one punter in the country, Peyton Todd, coming out of West Monroe High School in North Louisiana. All right, Wilson, so Joe Sloan will now, and Cortez Hankton will begin this trek on the field as co-offensive coordinator. What are the expectations here from what we've seen on offense to what the offense will look like moving forward? Was it just really about the player, or was that more about the strategy?
In terms of how successful LSU was last year, I think it was probably a combination of both. I mean, Mike Dimbrock was a good play caller, and he certainly, brought in this offense. And, he and Jaden spoke about this at times. They gave Jaden a lot of input in terms of what he wanted to see. But, obviously so much of it was sort of tailored to Jaden's strengths and what he did well. And now it really is in some ways a bit of a clean slate because, the offensive playbook and sort of philosophy isn't going to necessarily change a whole lot. But, LSU's got different personnel now in those key positions, like at quarterback and receiver, but especially at quarterback. And so, there's going to be changes that aren't necessarily a reflection so much of Mike Dimbrock leaving, but as much as they are of Jaden Daniels leaving. Because Mike probably would have adapted, to this new personnel. And now Joe's going to have to adapt to this new personnel. And I think the way that we're going to see it the most is in the run game. We talked to Brian Kelly about this last week, and he said that that's the biggest difference that you'll see, and that is because, LSU, as we know, was a zone read, inside zone team. That was their bread and butter because Jaden was so good at the zone read, and then the inside zone kind of built off of that. And now that's still going to be part of the offense, I think. But it's not going to be the only thing that you see in the run game like you did the last 2 years. Brian Kelly even said LSU will go under center at times, and there will be toss plays and pulling offensive linemen that we didn't really see a whole lot of the last 2 years, and counters and power and things like that are more of a traditional run game that LSU is going to need to be able to implement and get on the ground running quickly in order, no pun intended, I guess there, in order to be able to generate a rushing attack and replace Jaden's production.
A natural, Wilson Alexander. At WH Alexander _ is where you find him on social media. All right, on the other side is where everybody's looking, though, right? Blake Baker's coming in here to, really just kind of overhaul this defense that was historically bad. What do you make of the task that he has over the next couple of weeks?
Well, it's a tall one. It's a lot to do on that defensive side of the ball. And I think here in spring practice, are we going to really learn a whole lot about if LSU's actually better defensively? No, unfortunately, we won't. We probably won't really know until they hit the field against Southern Cal, in Las Vegas. But, I think in terms of what LSU's going to try to go about doing here in the spring is kind of really addressing some of the fundamental problems that they had last year. Tackling, pursuit angles, rallying to the football, and some of those basic things that this team struggled with a year ago on the defensive side. And Blake will also be, of course, implementing his scheme as we go along. And maybe we'll start to actually learn about what they have, what he's going to be doing schematically, because he was multiple at Missouri. They ran a 3-3-5 and a 4-2-5, and you could see it sort of adapt game to game based on the opponent and what they needed to do defensively. And so, but first of all, you just got to address some of those fundamental problems LSU had last year and sort of get these players to buy into what it is that he's selling. And, there's a lot of work that has to be done on the defensive side of the ball, just from a sort of philosophical and mindset point throughout this offseason, and then schematically and down to getting these players ready to go as well. So a lot to do this spring, certainly. And then there's a whole bunch of position battles that got to be settled too.
I guess you don't practice a player in a position if you don't plan on using him there. But, do you think that the ultimate spot for Perkins is going to be in the middle?
Well, it seems certainly headed that way. Based on what Brian Kelly has said, told me last week, and I think has said in follow-up interviews too, is he's going to be playing will linebacker. He's going to be that weak side linebacker, and that seems to be what they're committed to throughout the offseason. Could you change it here coming out of the spring if something really doesn't work? Sure, but that's a whole lot of wasted time if you do. And so, I think that's probably what they're going to try to stick to again. And obviously we thought that they would last year, and then they abandoned it after one game because we saw how that all went. So, but at this moment, it seems like that's what they're headed toward, is playing him at the will linebacker, having him in the box, and trying to get him more, well suited to that position, because of course it didn't work when they tried it a year ago. Maybe now it can, with a more aggressive style on defense, with a different linebackers coach, with a different defensive coordinator, and someone who has developed linebackers really well over the last few years in Blake Baker. Maybe now it could work, but either way, it seems like what they're committed to here moving forward this offseason.
Did you see these rule changes on the communication between sidelines and coaches? You think he would have the green dot on defense if there was a player, or would it be Greg Penn?
I think it would be Greg Penn, because, your middle linebacker is usually the one making those sorts of calls and communicating. And that's something that Greg has been, doing now for a couple of years at least last season on the defensive side, certainly. And I think maybe somewhat in 2022 as well. Doing a lot of that. And Greg's a good communicator there in the middle of the defense. That's something he's kind of known for. I wouldn't be surprised, he's one of the SWAT team leaders. I wouldn't be surprised if he's someone who's in contention for 18 this year. He's been in the program for a few years, coming back now as a senior, kind of known as a leader in that locker room. And so I would imagine he would get the green dot, because, I think he'd be making most of the calls.
Pivoting back to Perkins real quick, is the decision to move him back inside one based solely by Blake Baker, or is this kind of a Brian Kelly also call where he wants to see, because you heard what he mentioned last year, he's like, I want what's best for him in the future, where he's talking about the NFL, or is this Blake Baker coming in and saying, no, I can fix it, I think he was utilized incorrectly last year?
I don't know for certain, in terms of how we got to this point. It was probably a little bit of both, and, Harold, they probably talked to Harold about it too, if I had to guess. Just going into this offseason, you want to be in communication with the player and kind of figure out, what they're going to do, through those exit meetings. And, probably once Blake got here and talking to him about it. And also, it's somewhat necessitated, at least, to hear Brian Kelly talk about it, by what they're going to be doing defensively in terms of what they have, each position, on that defense do. What Harold did last year is now basically the star position. And that's kind of like a cross between a nickel corner and what Harold was as a Sam linebacker, nickel linebacker. And that's usually played by a defensive back. And Brian Kelly's quote was, that's not what we want Harold to be. And he was talking in terms of we, as if, which makes you think, him and Blake sort of discussed all this together. But I do, Blake brought in this scheme and probably has an idea of what he wants these players to do. But Brian, like you said, now for over a year, has said that this is probably what Harold's going to be doing, long term, and that it's their kind of responsibility to get him ready for that. But because they have that star position, and if you're not going to play him there, then you could do a number of different things with Harold because he's so talented. But it seems like that partly was a factor in this as well.
There feels like it's like 9 of 11 positions on defense are open. Is there a specific group or players that you're looking at to competition at a specific group? I mean, it looks like it's all over the defense, but I mean, is there anywhere on offense or maybe even on defense specifically where you say, I can't wait to watch that comp for that spot?
Well, corner on the defensive side in particular. I mean, we do sort of like the projected 2 deeps and things like that going into the spring. And I mean, at corner, you basically just had to say nobody is a projected starter at this point because it's just so wide open. I mean, you could throw out some names there, but I just feel like it's going to rotate around a lot here during the spring. Everybody's probably going to get a chance at some point who's in that competition. I mean, because you've got, Ashton Stamps coming back, and you've got Javian Toviano coming back. He might be an interesting person to play that star position or maybe even move around in the secondary because of what he's done before at safety. Sage Ryan coming back, but another guy who can maybe move around. And then, you bring in some freshmen. Most of them obviously won't get here until the summer, but, PJ Woodland's here, and I think he's going to be someone to watch here this spring. And then J.K. Johnson and Jair Brown. And there's just so many names that are in contention for that spot. Whereas even though you're looking at some other positions on the defense as having to replace guys, like when I think about like the Jack linebacker, with Ovi leaving and Braden Swinson really stepping into that, and maybe Deshaun Womack finally being able to get some more playing time. You at least only have like a couple of names that you really think of. At corner, it's like, I don't know, we list out 5 or 6 guys who are probably in the mix there, with Zy Alexander coming back in preseason camp too. So I think that's probably the most wide open competition and most unsettled spot on this roster going into the spring. But they also do have a lot of options and guys who are returning, which is a little bit different than the last couple of years.
Wilson Alexander every Tuesday right here with us, giving us the latest on LSU football. He's the best. Make sure and follow him on social media at WH Alexander to keep up with the latest. Thank you, my friend. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me, y'all. Have a good one.
There he is, Wilson, checking in right here on the beginning.